Welcome, everyone, to a webinar entitled The Holy See and the United Nations, the International Conference on Population and Development, Cairo 1994, as a case study, with presenters Dr. Jane Adolphe and Mr. John Klink. My name is Chris Riley, and I am an ITEST board member and editor of the ITEST journal, First Principles. The Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, ITEST, is an association of theologians, scientists, and others committed to a Catholic worldview in which faith and science collaborate in exploring the truth. ITEST explores truth theologically in the wisdom traditions of the human community and in the data studied in the sciences. ITEST's mission is to foster and disseminate the Catholic position that science and faith in God are complementary paths to human fulfillment. Before I introduce our first presenter, our opening prayer will be led by Sister Carla May Streeter, who is a Dominican sister of Catherine of Siena in Racine, Wisconsin. She is Professor Emerita at Aquinas Institute of Theology in St. Louis and an ITEST board member emerita.
Good morning, everybody. As we begin, let's just remember for a few seconds that we are like fish in the sea that is God's own presence. Most Holy One, in your kindness, bless us as we gather today. Bless our speakers and fill them with the wisdom that they want to share with us. Bless the organizations that we're going to be looking at today. Grant that they might have people over profit, and they might be filled with a sense of the common good. And bless us who take away this wisdom from this session, that we may be people of God in the world to which we're sent, so that we might give you great joy. Heal our wounded hearts with the chaos around us, and give us hope so that we might be your light. We ask this in the name of that one who has been given to us to show us the way home. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Sister Carla May. And now I'm delighted to introduce our first presenter. Dr. Jane F. Adolphe is a professor of law at Ave Maria School of Law in Naples, Florida, 2001 to the present, with degrees in common law, civil law, that's an LLB and BCL, and canon law, a JCL and JCD. She is also a lawyer qualified to practice law in Alberta, Canada, and New York, USA, with expertise in international human rights law and the Holy See. She is a former external advisor during 2002 to 2011, an internal advisor 2011 to 2020 to three popes, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis, through her work with the Papal Secretariat of State, Section for Relations with States. Jane is founder and executive director of the International Catholic Jurists Forum. Jane's presentation is titled The United Nations and the Holy See, an Introduction.
Thank you for the organizers and for the kind invitation to do this. I'm very glad to be able to work with John Klink, who I watched negotiate in the mid-1990s when he was doing that for the Holy See. And it's a great honor to be here. So Sheila's going to help me. There's going to be an outline that's going to be on the screen. That outline you'll be able to understand how I'm going to come through this presentation. We've got a lot to cover. This is quite a robust outline that I have, and it hopefully will be able to get done in 45 minutes. So first, let's start off with terminology. When we look at the United Nations organization, and it is an organization, what does that mean? It's intergovernmental. It was founded in 1945 after World War II with a multilateral treaty entitled the Charter of the United Nations, which is currently made up of 193 member states. The term United Nations system is something that one might frequently encounter, and it includes a sprawling network of semi-autonomous bodies and subsidiary bodies set up by the original 6 principal organs set out in the Charter. Now, we have a UN system chart, which is helpful to get an understanding of what this beast is. And it is a beast because when you look at the United Nations system, you will see the 6 principal organs on the far left: General Assembly, Security Council, Economic and Social Council, Secretariat, International Court of Justice, and the Trusteeship Council, which is largely defunct because it was used for the decolonization period. We will come back to this when we look a little bit more in detail of these organs, but you can see that through the General Assembly, its subsidiary organs, it was permitted in the UN Charter, has expanded, and you can see the same for the Security Council, Economic and Social Council, the Secretariat. And what you have on the far left are these related organizations, and that's why we're getting into the idea of system. The UN Charter is the constitutional charter for this whole organization and allowed these 6 principal organs to create these subsidiary bodies. And the UN Charter goes into detail with respect to the powers of these 6 principal organs, but you will not have any details with respect to the subsidiary organs that were created later. So you also have specialized agencies on the far right, and then there's a note as to what these specialized agencies mean because they're semi-autonomous. So if we return now to terminology and we go back to the understanding of other terms, for example, the Holy See. The Holy See, and some people have actually thought that See is S-E-A. It's Holy S-E-E. It's not a body of water. It is the international legal name for the Pope, who is a subject of international law and treated as equivalent to that of a state. It's usually referred to as sui generis, something unto itself. And it has chosen to be a permanent observer within the United Nations system as opposed to a member state. And the mission of the Holy See is moral and spiritual rather than political. The term Holy See originates from the Latin term Sancta Sedes, meaning holy chair, the enthronement ceremony of the bishop in Rome. And it's worth noting that See, S-E-E, evolved from the Latin sedes, S-E-D-E-S, via Old French, S-I-E, to Middle English, S-E, and then S-E-E. So that's why it's not Holy Seat, it's Holy See. And we have to make a distinction between the Holy See and the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is a visible and invisible reality, a community. And we also have to make a distinction between the Holy See and Vatican City State, which is a small territory created in 1929 via a treaty between the Holy See, the Pope, and Mussolini. Now, it's a kind of an interesting thing is because in Catholic theology, we talk about the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And of course, we've got a little Trinity going on here. The Holy See, the Catholic Church, and Vatican City State, they're separate and distinct, but intricately related. And there is a very helpful document. It was an explanation to a list of questions that was put to the Holy See by the Committee on the Rights of the Child in 2014. And this document is available on the website. But in this document, it's separated into 3 paragraphs: the Holy See in Vatican City State, and the Holy See in the Catholic Church. And with respect to the Holy See from this document, it does emphasize that the Roman Pontiff is used, or the Pope is used in a narrow sense, and also the Roman Pontiff with his dicasteries, especially the Secretariat of State in the broader sense. And then with respect to Vatican City State, these replies that the Holy See gave to the Committee on the Rights of the Child also talked about Vatican City State and noted that it was created to more effectively promote the spiritual and moral mission of the Holy See. And so when people use these colloquial references to the Holy Sees of the Vatican, that's absolutely incorrect and misleading, because we've got these 3 these three entities, and Vatican City State is a territory. When we go and consider the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church is a non-territorial entity. It's a spiritual community of faith, hope, and charity, constituted as a visible society founded on the communion of faith, sacraments, discipline, and governance by its internal legal system, canon law. Consequently, the Holy See really is the subject of international law, and it actually can enter into treaties on behalf of itself or on behalf of Vatican City State, and also on behalf of the Holy See and Vatican City State. There are these three possibilities. It does not enter into treaties per se for the Catholic Church, which is more of a moral subject on the international level. It's not considered this international personality or subject of international law. That name that we give it is the Holy See. So it's a little bit confusing, but I always look at it as a mystery, a little bit of the mystery like the Trinity. If we go to the Holy See website, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, it always helps to have a bit of a visual here. The Holy See has its own website. And if you go to the Holy See website, you'll see there Pope Leo XIV waving to us. And if you scroll down, you're going to get to the bottom of the page. And the bottom of the page gives you a search mechanism to find the magisterium of the other popes. But what you have here for our purposes is on the far left, this box that says Roman Curia and other organizations. And if you click that on, you're going to get all of the dicasteries. So when you talk about the Holy See, in the narrow sense, we're talking about the Pope, and then the broader sense, this is what we're talking about in the broader sense, whether there's certain acts that are from these other dicasteries. And if you go to the Secretariat of State, this is in English, by the way, and so it's not being updated. You have a section for general affairs, a section for relations with states and international organizations. This has not been updated according to the new constitution I'm sure it's been updated in Italian, but it has not been updated in English. They have a new constitution. The past constitution set up by John Paul II was Pastor Bonus, and this is Predicate Evangelium is the new constitution that sets out the three. There's actually three divisions, I believe, and the third division is with respect to nuncios. And there's slightly changes in names. And again, this website, this in English is not up to date. Okay, so just to let you know, to get a visual when we start to talk about the Roman Curia or the Holy See or the Pope's departments. Okay, and so then you have to ask the question is, why does the Holy See participate in the United Nations in the first place? And we're going to come back to that question later on, but we might as well deal with it briefly right now. And I think one of the best articulations was given by John Paul II. John Paul II in 1979 appeared before the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly. And in his statement, and if you go to the first original paragraphs of the statement, it's giving a congratulations to the organization, and he's introducing himself. And he talks about how there's a special bond between the Apostolic See with the United Nations organization, as visualized by the Holy Sees, and it's called Permanent Observer. It's not a UN member state. And then it talks about how it was the need of the papacy to exercise its mission in full freedom and to be able to deal with an interlocutor, whether a government or an international organization. And what he's talking about there is he's trying to explain to the Holy See why there is the state of Vatican City State, which is a territory over which the Pope it's a territorial sovereignty with respect to this small state. Why does the Holy or the Pope, why is he the monarch of this territory? And he's explaining it is because it needs to have this territory to exercise its full freedom before international organizations and other governments, without dependence or in other sovereignties. And I look at it as the city with the little administrative hub. He also talks in this General Assembly intervention, the spiritual mission of the Apostolic See in the Church. And in this regard, he's talking about the tasks and activities that they participate in. And he also refers to himself as Apostolic See. In the Code of Canon Law, Apostolic See and Holy See are used interchangeably. And he says, I have said, this confidence and conviction on the part of the Holy Apostolic See is the result, as I have said, not of merely political reasons, but of the religious and moral character of the mission of the Roman Catholic Church. As a universal community embracing faithful, belonging to almost all countries and continents, nations, peoples, races, languages, and cultures, the Church is deeply interested in the existence and activity of the organization whose very name tells us that it unites and associates nations and states. It unites and associates. It does not divide and oppose. And then he goes on in paragraph 5. It is certainly a high significant fact that among the representatives of the states whose raison d'être is the sovereignty of powers linked with territory and people, there is also today the representative of the Apostolic See in the Catholic Church. He's making a distinction there. The Holy See is used interchangeably with Apostolic Church, but he uses "and" because they're two separate entities. The Church is the Church of Jesus Christ, who declared before the tribunal of the Roman judge Pilate that he was a king, but with a kingdom not of this world. When he was then asked about the reason for the existence of his kingdom among men, he replied, "For this I was born, and for this I have come into the world, to witness to the truth." So here before the representations of the states, I wish not only to thank you, but also to offer my special congratulations, since the invitation extended to the Pope to speak in your assembly shows that the United Nations organization accepts and respects the religious and moral dimension of those human problems that the Church attends to in view of the message of truth and love, and that is her duty to bring to the world. So what we have here is a very profound statement of the mission of the Holy See within this organization. And as we're going to discuss a little bit later with this move to global partnerships, that the Holy See is not a mere stakeholder or a mere partner like other partners. It is special unto itself, and it has a spiritual and moral mission, as John Paul II exclaimed. If we move on now to part 2, and we look at the United Nations organization and the UN system, I think what I'm doing here is taking you through some of the pillars of this system. And basically, the charter itself is a preamble with 19 chapters and 111 articles. It basically, as I noted before, sets out the 6 principal organs. The General Assembly, there's about 193 member states, and it's one state, one vote when they meet. The Security Council is basically made up of 15, and there's an interchangeable with some of those members, but there's 5 permanent members, which is France, China, France, Russia, UK, and the US, and they all have vetoes. So that means that whatever resolution is put there can be stopped or blocked by one of these 5 countries. With the Economic and Social Council, you have 54 members, and that's divided up into several committees, as the General Assembly is set up into different committees. The Trusteeship Council was set up for the decolonization period and is largely defunct, and then you have an International Court of Justice with about 15 judges. And then you have a secretariat. And as we saw from the diagram, let's just go back to the diagram for a minute. The diagram, we see the 6 principal organs on the left. That's really what the UN Charter talks about. And then you have this huge, sprawling system, a bureaucratic system that has now been created. I want to go quickly to an image, if I could, of the UN General Assembly, because I think these images are good for you to see. The General Assembly meeting room is, you'll see the way that's semicircular, and then it's by alphabetical order of the states, the member states first, and then it's followed by the permanent observer states, which the Holy See is part of that, and also Palestine. Switzerland used to be a permanent observer. Now it's a full member state. And John will likely talk about this a little bit more. You'll see in that meeting room screens. this is the General Assembly room, but in conferences and international conferences where John has participated and he's going to explain, there's similar rooms in the sense that they have to have the seating, they have to have people, the states in alphabetical order. And back in the day with John, there probably wasn't technology and a screen so that you could put up the document. Usually what ends up happening is a body within the United Nations who has created, with the participation of a small number of member states, a preparatory document through preparatory meetings. And that preparatory document is then put up on the screen. When now we're talking about negotiations, you're putting the preparatory document on the screen. You go comma by comma, word by word. And if a country has an opposition to a word, it can ask to bracket the word or say what it wants to include. Now, you can see that this is quite a tedious exercise, and John will go in this with more detail. If there is a problem with a word, they usually break out into a smaller room, and that would be maybe 5 or 6 states, maybe even more. If the word was gender, for example, and that was bracketed, they move on to another meeting room, and they're going to have to sort that out, and they're going to have to come back into the plenary. The interesting thing about this is the smaller your delegation is, the less that you can go into these breakout rooms. Because your delegation is too small, you probably have to have one person in the plenary session all the time. Before, you couldn't probably go to all the meetings of breakout sessions where some of these words, the ambiguous words, were sorted out in those meetings. So I show this image so that you can get an understanding of what it looks like when you're in a negotiation room. And John will show you, well, and John was representing the Holy See, and he probably wouldn't have been the permanent observer, because at the UN major conferences, that's a whole different animal, in the sense that the Holy See acts as one of the full members in these conferences, which is not the same at the General Assembly. The General Assembly is split up into member states and permanent observer states. But John will explain in more detail. I don't think John had the benefit of these screens. I think they just had to go through the document word by word. So if we go on now, we take a look at some of the key players. Before I go and talk about the key players, I want to just talk briefly about the purposes and principles. So if you go to the UN Charter and you go to the purposes and principles in Article 1, it talks about maintaining international peace and security in Article 1. In Article 2, it talks about respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determinations of peoples, and returns to the question again when it says that it should take all appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. 3 and 4 are talking more about international cooperation between states on various other issues. But you can see in this that the key is peace and security. If you go to the principles in Article 2 of the organization, one of the first principles is the principle of the sovereign equality of all of its member states. And that's an important principle. It doesn't depend on your size or your might or how much you may influence the community. It's sovereign equality of all its member states. On number 2, it talks about that they should fulfill in good faith the obligations assumed by them in accordance with the present charter. This is basically telling you that this is a self-implementation system. This is something that in international law, we talk about the difference between a horizontal system and a vertical system. A vertical system, we refer to the domestic situation, where you usually have constitutions that go up from, and statutes and case law. You have judges, you have your administration of justice, you have police officers, you have these implementation mechanisms within the domestic. That is not the case internationally. The international system is a horizontal system where all these states are equal and sovereign, and they have to self-implement, although the United Nations Forum has developed these mechanisms to nudge them along. The peace and security resolutions that come out of the Security Council, one would argue, when they do come out, they're supposed to be collective actions, and one would say, well, that aren't those binding? And that's something that's always discussed in international law. The resolutions that come out of the UN General Assembly are not binding resolutions. And so, again, it's up to the states to self-implement. Now, if you go to Article 3, you're going to come to talk about international disputes must be peacefully resolved, and you cannot use a threat or use of force. This organization was to promote peace and security. And it says it several times within this opening, the purposes and principles. If you go to the last one, this is kind of an interesting one that talks about the Charter authorizing the United Nations cannot intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. And of course, that principle states will cite frequently, but we know that if you go back to that UN chart and the bureaucracy there, you know on a number of issues that they seem to be getting into local issues. And so there's tension with that principle. Okay, so if we go to the key players here, the key actors, so if you go to the website of the United Nations, you will come under UN member states. The membership of the UN is under articles, and it's in Chapter 2, it's Articles 3 to 6, and Article 4.1 says, quote, is open to all peace-loving states that accept the obligations contained in the United Nations, close quote. Now, the Holy See technically could become a member state. It is chosen not to. It is a permanent observer, and a permanent observer it's a practice that's based purely on a case-by-case basis. It's not written in the Charter. There's no provisions in the Charter, and it may include at any one time states, and that would be the Holy See is equivalent to a state. And as I said before, there's Switzerland, Palestine, I believe is there. You also have regional intergovernmental organizations. Regional intergovernmental organizations, what are those? Can be at the European, Inter-American, African levels. And you can have them there as a permanent observer. In terms of the participation of the Holy See in the work of the United Nations, a specific resolution was created for the Holy See. This was after there was a challenge to the Holy See status by mostly progressive organizations who were discontented with the Holy See's effective diplomacy and participation in some of the UN major conferences, which we're going to discuss shortly. And if we could just take a look at the document of the General Assembly talking about the Holy See. So in the document itself, you will find that it goes through and talks about when the Holy See became a member. And it then goes through some of its activities with respect to various instruments. So it says, recalling also that the Holy See is a party to. And remember what I had mentioned before, the Holy See is the key thing when you have the ministry, the Trinity, the Holy See, the Catholic Church, Vatican City State. It can ratify a document on behalf of itself, ratify a document on behalf of itself and Vatican City State, or ratify a document only on behalf of Vatican City State. Again, the Catholic Church is a moral entity here. It's not considered this on the international. If you go further into the document, you're going to have another paragraph that talks about the Holy See actively participating as an observer in many of the specialized agencies. Those were on the right hand of that sprawling UN chart. And so it names some of these activities. It also talks about the Economic and Social Council. That's one of the principal organs of the United Nations. And it's an important body and has become an important body over time, specifically when the Security Council has been blocked by those vetoes for peace and security. We have a lot of concentration on some other issues on the Economic and Social Council. So if you go to number 1, it says, right before the annex, it says, acknowledging that the Holy See in its capacity as an observer state shall be accorded the rights and privileges of participants in the sessions and works of the General Assembly and the international conferences. Now, John will be talking about his participation in one of these international conferences convened under the Assembly. Okay, if you go to the annex, it's going to talk about what the Holy See can do, and this is pursuant to the General Assembly. Every conference has different rules and it has to adopt its different rules, and John will go into that. So with the General Assembly, which is a principal organ of the United Nations, you have the Holy See has rights and privileges, has a right to participate in the general debate. It can also right to make interventions, right of reply, right to have communications related to the sessions distributed and circulated, right to have its communications relating to the sessions and work circulated directly. the right to raise points of order, the right to co-sponsor draft resolutions. And then it talks about the seating, because this is all important on the diplomatic level. Seating for the Holy See shall be arranged immediately after member states and before the other observers when it participates as a non-member state observer in the General Assembly Hall. And as we know, for conferences, that may not be the case, where the rules are slightly different. Okay, so if we go back now to the general outline to see where we are, we've gone through and looked a little bit at the Holy See's participation. Let's go into the UN system a bit now here, and let's take a look at the human rights, because what we've talked about so far is this understanding of the real focus of creating a forum to help states maintain peace and security, okay? And there is rules of force. You're not supposed to use force. You can use force in cases of self-defense and defense of others, but otherwise you're supposed to resolve your disputes peacefully. If we now go into this section talking about human rights, this is a huge theme within the United Nations system. So the UN Charter, if we go back to that constitutional document, this is just an example. There's two key references. There's other references to fundamental human rights, but there's two key references. It talks about, this is in preamble paragraph 2, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to develop friendly relations among nations based on the respect for principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. And that's Article 1.2. So that's in the UN Charter, and it's in other places as well. I'll just highlight those two. And so in 1948, there was a group that got together to say, well, we've got to flesh out these human rights. We've got to, articulate them. We don't really know what they are. And so that's where the initiative began. We knew that in 1946, remember that according to the Charter, all of the principal organs can set up subsidiary bodies. And so the 1946 UN Commission on Human Rights was set up by ECOSOC and was tasked to flesh out references to human rights that were mentioned, that I would just mention from the UN, from the 1945 Charter. The Commission in turn set up a drafting committee and went through a similar thing that I spoke about. You're going to have someone drafted up, Humphrey, I believe his name is, a Canadian who was working with the General Secretariat at that time for the UN. He just drafted a list of rights that he had looked at in the past, and then that became your basic preparation document, and then they started to develop that from there on. And you have it going between the UN Commission on Human Rights to this drafting committee. It also went to ECOSOC, and eventually it made it to a committee of the UN General Assembly, the third committee that deals a lot with human rights, and eventually to the UN General Assembly itself. The UDHR is essentially a resolution that was adopted, and it is a declaration on 1948, and it was adopted by 48 votes with 8 abstentions. And so you have, because we have a smaller number of states participating at that time. And it is a preamble with 30 articles. It has civil and political, social, cultural, and economic rights. It was supposed to be a non-binding declaration followed immediately with one covenant, a binding document that would have all those rights together. That did not happen. It took 20 years. Because of the Cold War, there was a division as to the importance of these rights. So you actually have 2 covenants, civil and political, and then another one on social, culture, and economic. I think you can probably guess who thought that civil and political were priorities and which countries thought social, cultural, and economic were more priorities. And so you could see the United States, for example, on one hand, and then the Soviet Union on the other hand, as it was referred to then, Russia now, with respect to social cultural rights. And so these would have been negotiated over time. Now, these 2 covenant documents weren't in force until 1976. So what ends up happening is you have the UDHR in 1948 is quoted so many times prior to these binding documents that it starts to take on this idea that it may be customary international law and binding because it's been referred to so many times and referred to so many times with an idea that it's binding. And that's called custom in international law. So I want to talk about, when we talk about these human rights, there is a rule of law here. And when we talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a founding document, this is a course in and of itself. And one of the debates that's going on right now is whether that Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognized natural law principles and how it did that and whether it's done. And the debate really is between international lawyers who are using these documents on a daily basis to say, yes, it recognizes natural law principles. It's a man-made document. It's a positive document, but it actually takes up some natural law principles. And then you have philosophers that are saying, no, whatever it's embraced, it's not in accordance with natural law, and certainly not in accordance with classical understandings, natural law and natural rights. And that's a debate that's ongoing right now. And the Holy See has always stood firm in saying that this document is important, that it does embrace and recognize natural law principles, and that it should continue to be studied and deepened in people's understanding. If we look at and come back to this understanding of binding documents, this is an important thing in international law, and you have to make a distinction. If we look at a domestic situation, you're pulled over by the police on the side of the road because you've breached likely a statute. So you say, what is it that governs me in the domestic field? And you talk about statutes, constitutional law, and other types of laws. On the international, you're looking at treaties, international custom and practice over time as evidence is accepted as law. And then you have general principles of law that you pop up from the lower level. Judicial decisions are not binding, but they can tell you what the law is as opinions of scholars. There's key human rights bodies in the United Nations. I'm going to skip over that because I'm out of time. I just want to say that there is something called the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. If you want to interpret a treaty, there's certain principles in order to do that. So this is not an evolving understanding of treaties. States have to treat, and then the role of interpreting treaties is the state, not some treaty body made up of former NGO leaders or non-jurists. Okay, I want to come to the last section. I'm a little bit behind. This is on UN major conferences. So the UN major conferences, there was a first wave from about the 1968 to the 1985. And you'll see when I refer to the major ones in 1990, and I'd just like to go to this annex that I have in the 1990s, and you will see, because some of them are, so if you go to 1990 on this annex of major conferences, you will see that the second United Nations Conference on Least Developed Countries took place in 1990, but there was a first wave of conferences, and so your first conference would have taken place during that time period. 1990, you have a World Summit on Children. 1992, you have, it's called the Earth Summit on Environmental and Development. You had prior conferences on that as well in the 1970s. World Conference on Human Rights took place in 1993. You have one on sustainable development of small island developing states in 1994, and realized that sustainable development was also important for the Youth Summit, even though sustainable development as a concept starts to be used quite effectively in a lot of these documents, I believe since 1992, and maybe earlier, if I'm not mistaken. 1994, you've got Population and Develop at Cairo. This is John that's going to speak about this. 1995, Social Development, Women, Human Settlements. That's basically where we're living. 1996, that's Habitat 2. That means that there was a conference on that, and that would have been the first wave of conferences. Okay, so why do we care about these conferences? What's happening here? So what you have in these conferences, and I want to talk about a transformation. You have a transformation, and this is an argument being made by Marguerite Peters in her book, and I fully recommend her book, Global Governance, 1945 to 1996. She discusses, and she entitles it, History of a Quiet Revolution Within the United Nations. And so what is she arguing? She's essentially arguing that the pivotal moment and the vehicle to transform the United Nations was through these conferences. So she argues that from its creation in 1945, the United Nations organization, largely a forum to push peace and security among states, had this and is today. It talks about global governance. So where I have used the term international law, they've left international law to talk about global, and then they talk about global governments. And Peters argues that this global governance regime is based on public-private partnerships. And what do we mean by that? State partnering up with big farm, big tech, big business, and a lot of non-governmental organizations. Understanding that the non-governmental organizations, there was a seed for non-governmental organizations back in the day in Article 71 of the UN Charter. ECOSOC could create NGOs. Now it's massive. It's massive. And when you have big farm, big tech, big business that can create their own NGOs at the international, national, and regional levels, you then have a top-down type of system that has been developed. And so it's public-private partnerships working with UN bureaucrats, and non-governmental organizations are part of this private partnership. And you have to ask yourself, who's accountable? Non-governmental organizations are not accountable to anybody, neither are CEOs to the general public. It's only the state that you've elected, these representatives, and specifically I'm talking about democracies. And so this whole understanding now has created an entity that needs to be unpacked. And she talks about it not being an evolution, even though the charter talked about cooperation. She actually talks about a revolution, and she uses that term in the sense that she says it's a rapid intergovernmental adoption. And she talks a lot about how it uses the term global consensus, which is not only about nation states, but non-state actors. And at that point, with this global government regime, you have to understand that it seems to have moved from the primacy of the nation state to what they talk about is multi-stakeholders, a number of different states, from the bureaucrats to member states, but to non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations. You even have now CEOs of companies participating in the UN meetings specifically on their themes of business and AI, et cetera, et cetera. So what we have here with her thesis, she says, listen, what was really the glue that tied all of this transformation together is something called sustainable development. They created this term, which is an umbrella term that's sweeping, that includes everything. And when we say, well, what are you talking about? What is this thing? And if we go to second annex in the outline, you will see that UN General Assembly resolution that was produced in 2015. It's divided into three parts: a preamble, a declaration. It has 17 development goals, 169 targets. It has an implementation process to nudge those states along to implement, and it's based on global partnership. It has also a follow-up and review. The most important thing is the term sustainable development is not defined in a single paragraph. What does that mean? It's an ever-evolving content, and sustainable development means that it's also a process. So one of the things that you have to recognize is that the Sustainable Development Goals, transforming our world, where you find it, if you go to paragraph 11 of Transforming Our World, you will see the following statement. We affirm the outcomes of all major UN conferences and summits which have a solid foundation for sustainable development and have helped to shape the new agenda. Those include, and it starts to list some of the UN conferences that I put on the chart above, but it mentions John's conference, the Program of Action of the International Conference on Population and Development. If you go to to paragraph 13 or article 13 in that document, it says, the challenges and commitments contained in these major conferences and summits are interrelated and call for integrated solutions. That's kind of a key word for top down, right? Common solutions. And then those have to be implemented top down. A new approach is needed. Sustainable development recognizes that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, combating inequality with and among states, all those things which it lists are laudable goals. So that's not really the question. I think everybody wants to eradicate poverty and combat equality, legitimate inequality or unjust inequality, because we know everybody's born into different circumstances. We're in a unity and diversity here. And so it's a matter of what we mean by these terms, and specifically when a group from above is telling us how we're supposed to be doing this. So just in ending, one of the things we need to talk about is, well, what is the Holy See's attitude towards this agenda? And I think that's what's really important is a 2016 note. So a year after, the Holy See negotiated this document, the Sustainable Development Documents, or Agenda 2030, rightly called Transforming Our World. And then a year later, on its anniversary, it sent a note to the General Secretary of the United Nations and asked that it be formally adopted as a document within the UN system. And that's what you do. And if you go through the document, it starts off very positively with the introduction with the proper and laudable aspirations, the 2030 Agenda, a non-binding international plan of action. Why is it saying that? Because it's non-binding on states, and it's highlighting that issue. And then it says, number 2, in fulfilling its specifically spiritual and moral mission in the international community within the framework of particular status in the United Nations, the Holy See actively participates in the negotiations over the course. And it's highlighting its spiritual and moral mission. It quotes Pope Francis at the time, who was really very active. He was active in the negotiations. He was working to get sexual or human trafficking included as a goal to eradicate that, and was successful. The document itself is lengthy for the United Nations, but this foresees what John's going to talk about, because it talks about general principles of the Holy See, how the Holy See sees sustainable development. It says we're talking about integral human development, recognizing the poor as dignified agents of their own destiny, providing both spiritual and material means, respect for the principle of justice, to give to the other what is his due, the right to education and the light of the transcendent dignity of the human person, respect for the rule of law, peaceful resolution of disputes. It's picking up on the UN documents itself, service to others and respect for the common good, building the foundation of universal fraternity. Part 2 gets into the agenda itself and says, listen, there's some things we disagree with in this agenda. So we're going to interpret it in a specific way, and it's going to apply to us differently. And these are called legal reservations if you go to the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. It'll go through what it sees to be the purpose of the agenda. It then highlights the centrality of the human person, gives its understanding of the concept of human dignity, because we know that human dignity can be defined in a number of ways, and one of them can be defined very subjectively. It talks about the promotion of women and men, girls and boys. You notice that it doesn't use the term empowerment. That would bring in a radical feminist understanding. It then talks about health, and John will go into more detail on how the health has been promoting all kinds of ideologies. And then we talk about the rights and duties of the family, and the Holy See here. The key family is the natural family based on marriage between one man and one woman. And that is why that is your natural understanding of the family. That natural understanding of the family is protected in Article 16 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it's supposed to be protected by society and the state. And then you have the rights and duties of parents. Freedom of religion, integral human development. It gives its definition and how it's going to look at sustainable development. And I'm going to close my comments there, and I think this is a good segue into John Klink's presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, for your presentation. And now I'm pleased to introduce our second presenter. John Klink holds a BA from Santa Clara University and an MA from Georgetown University in English Literature. John was an executive with the Catholic Relief Services, serving in underdeveloped countries in North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. He was recruited by the Vatican and subsequently the White House to serve as a diplomat negotiator for scores of United Nations World Summits and conferences during the critical period of the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of the European Union. He became an advisor to popes and presidents, was elected president of the International Catholic Migration Commission, and with his wife Patricia began a sovereign securities firm on Wall Street. His distinctive honors include Knight Commander of the Order of St. Gregory the Great, Knight of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, Knight of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem, Knight of the Sacred Military Constantinian Order of St. George, Knight of Columbus, 3rd degree, and a Knight of Saints Maurice and Lazarus. He also was honored by the Royal Thai Armed Forces Award for the humanitarian assistance of displaced persons in Thailand, the 41st CRS Anniversary Award for humanitarian assistance, and the Legatus Ambassador Award. John's presentation is titled Gift of Divine Providence, My Role as a Papal Diplomat under St. John Paul II.
Well, first, I'd like to begin with my sincere thanks to iTest, to Sheila Roth, Chris Riley, Sebastian Mahfoud, for organizing this wonderful podcast. And I think it would be good to just set the stage as to how I happened to be involved in all of this. And I think it has to do with God's great sense of humor, because I began, as Chris just mentioned, as a literature major, and ended up giving quite a few years to Catholic Relief Services. And it was as an offshoot of that the rest of my life fell in place. And it was because I had been assigned as the director of Catholic Relief Services in Thailand, and we were taking care of 400,000 Khmer refugees at that point. And so on the third anniversary of Pope John Paul, I was invited to the nunciature, and the nunciature, at the nunciature, I in order to get there, I was driving back from the border camps and my car broke down. And so I had to take a bus and then a taxi over to the nuncio's. And by the time I got there, I was, the last person was leaving, the last guest was leaving. So I said to the Archbishop, well, why don't I just come back another day? And he said, by no means. He said, he said, I've been wanting to speak to you. And I said, really? And so we started talking, and he immediately highlighted that St. John Paul, in sending him just a few months earlier to Thailand, had urged him to ensure that the Khmer people would not become a forgotten people. And that then, in turn, I said, well, would you be interested in visiting the camp? And he said, in the coming months. And he said, how about next week? And so that was the beginning of our 43-year friendship, which finally culminated with his passing last October. And so I just wanted to mention that began this wonderful relationship that I had with the Archbishop, who then subsequently became Cardinal. And in 1986, it happened that he was assigned, as Providence would have it, as the Holy See's permanent representative to the United Nations. And then that was 1987, and my wife and I were married in 1987, and so he was kind enough to come to our wedding and preside over our wedding. And in the parking lot, he asked me if I would help him at the UN. And I said, for how long? And he said, like 2 weeks. And that 2 weeks extended a little bit longer to 14 years. And, suddenly the first time I was I was negotiating was because I had been made the Vatican's representative on the UNICEF executive board, and at that point they were heading into a world summit for children, which was the first world summit that had ever been held. And we had the picture there is on the screen is that's in Thailand with Her Majesty the Queen, and the royal family was very, very helpful to us in terms of doing our work with the refugees. And then the next shot, I think, well, yeah, this is on the refugee on the border, and that's the Crown Prince of Cambodia. And he had just set up that day a capital in exile. And so we had moved part of our operations over to take care of 30,000 refugees that had arrived that day there. And so these were the things that the Archbishop and I became involved in. And then so at our wedding, as I say, the Archbishop presided. And then he asked me to help him. And so then I go to the next shot. And so this is still our wedding. And this is us in New York after he had asked me to help him. And keep going. And so then I became a diplomat negotiator at the United Nations. And as I was saying, that the World Summit for Children. Something ringing there. And so the World Summit for Children had 71 heads of state or heads of government. And it was attended by Cardinal Casaroli and Archbishop Sodano, who was to become Cardinal Casaroli was the Secretary of State of the Vatican, and Archbishop Sodano was to become the Secretary of State immediately after this meeting. And these are all of the heads of state, and you can see included there is President Bush, Margaret Thatcher, and King Baudouin, and from all over the world, the Prime Minister of Canada. And so this turned out to be a very, very successful meeting, and the United Nations decided that it was a key to success, so they began to introduce similar meetings for various subjects such as the environment and women and population. And as Jane had mentioned, while the Holy See as an observer was not able to negotiate in the United Nations itself at that time in particular, as a member of a world conference, it has the exact same status as, say, the United States or any other state. And so we were able to negotiate. And this set the stage for John Paul's interest and eventual intervention as the world conferences kept going. So the next slide. And so this was our audience with the Holy Father in preparation to go to the Cairo Population Conference. And the Cairo Population Conference it had become a world issue when the Holy Father himself happened to read the document that had been written for this. And while the World Summit for Children and the World Summit on the environment were not that controversial, because they were dealing with children, and because, frankly, the Bush White House was not going to allow a lot of other things to enter into the negotiations. By the time we get to Cairo, that wasn't the case. And so, please change the Next shot. And so this is with my family, my son. Keep going. And so again, these are a little out of order. It's my fault. Next. And so this is when the Archbishop became a cardinal. Keep going. And eventually, keep going. We'll go back to this. And this is later. Sorry. That's still later. Sorry. And here we are at the World Summit for the Environment. You can see George Bush not quite speaking to Fidel Castro, but all the world leaders were there. And this is setting the stage. The World Summit for Children was in 1990. The World Summit on the Environment was 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. And it was all quite reasonable. And at the beginning of this conference, we had achieved a very clear wording that everyone felt that they could live within the bounds of, including the progressives and ourselves. And so at the opening of that meeting, for instance, I asked if they were going to reopen the negotiations. And fortunately, they said no. And that was what I wanted them to say, because then the conference, we didn't have to do any more negotiations. We had done all the pre-negotiations, and that stood. And they were afraid that I wanted to reopen the negotiations, but we wanted to keep the negotiation. So as I say, that was very non-controversial, and we all signed off on the document without any problem. Keep going. Next shot. So by the time we get to the Cairo Population Conference, the beginning of the Cairo Population Conference, there were multiple pre-conferences that we had to go to from all over the world. One was in Amman, one was in Senegal, one was in Geneva, and one was in New York. And so John Paul got his hands on a copy of the draft population document, which had been written by UNFPA, the United Nations Fund for Population Activities. And it was written under the direction of Dr. Nafis Sadiq, whose picture you just saw. And she ended up having a meeting with the Pope, and the Pope read the document and was highly concerned about that. If you can go down to the Pope's document down below, and this is a letter that he had written. Still keep going. No, I don't know where that. There is a document that was written by a letter written by the Pope, and I can quote from it. And he says, "As the preparations for the Cairo conference proceed, I wish to assure you, Madam General Secretary, that the Holy See is fully aware of the complexity of the issues involved. This very complexity requires that we carefully weigh the consequences for the present and future generations of the strategies and recommendations to be proposed. In this context, the draft final document of the Cairo conference, which is already being circulated, is a cause of grave concern to me. Many of the principles which I have mentioned," and he was mentioning particularly human dignity and the importance of the family, "find no place in its pages or are totally marginalized. Indeed, certain basic ethical principles are contradicted by its proposals. Political or ideological considerations cannot be by themselves the basis on which essential decisions for the future of our society are founded. What is at stake here is the very future of humanity. Fundamental questions like the transmission of life, the family, and the material and moral development of society need very serious consideration. And so as a result of, when Dr. Nafis Sadik visited the Holy Father for an audience, she thought that they were going to be discussing this. And he read this letter to her because he had gone through it tooth and nail. And he presented the letter to her and then published it. And then he also sent an unprecedented letter to every head of state stating that a document so intimately tied to the human family deserved their personal attention. And as he stated, issues upon which our societies stand or fall. And he emphasized the sacredness of life, love, and self-sacrifice. And then the Pope went through his Sunday Angelus addresses. I think it was 12 in all, framing the population issues from a religious and an ethical perspective, and appealing to the leaders, quote, concerned for the good of their people and all humanity, unquote. And he used, therefore, the Holy See's diplomatic network, leveraging its observer status and global ambassadors, the nuncios, to influence world leaders. And in all of this, he had been inspired by UNICEF, Jim Grant's summit strategy, because he wasn't going to start at the bottom. He went to all of the world leaders as a world leader, as a head of state, to alert them to what was coming down, that he was very, very, very concerned about. And so it was interesting because he tried to call President Clinton, and President Clinton refused his call. And Ambassador Ray Flynn, who was the former mayor of Boston, who was a Democrat, and you can see here in this picture, he's with President Clinton and the Pope. He took it upon himself. He kept trying to, because at this time he was the ambassador, Clinton's ambassador to the Holy See, and the White House just wasn't taking his calls. And so he flew by himself to Washington and confronted Hillary Clinton in the hallways. And he threatened to have a press conference to ensure that the Pope's voice would be heard. And he said that if he didn't get a response by 5 o'clock, that he would have this press conference. So the call did take place, and the Pope did speak to him, but it was only because Ray Flynn had done this. And he put his career at risk, and he subsequently, I believe he was relieved of his post not too long afterwards. And then, so you can imagine going into this conference, and the Pope has declared war on the initial document. He was happy to have a document that was on population, but he wanted it to be a constructive one that took into account religious perspectives, and not only Catholic, but also Islamic perspectives and others. But the Islamists within the United Nations had decided to promote Nafis Sadik as the head of the conference because she was Muslim, and they thought that way the Muslims wouldn't dare to intervene at all. And it was very interesting because the Egyptian government was trying to be very close to the United States, and so they put an armed guard around us and tried to prevent us from speaking to anybody outside of the conference. For instance, we couldn't go and speak to any normal Egyptians. And I mean, we were probably too busy to do so in the first place. But it got to a point one day when Archbishop Martino, who was the head of delegation, got a phone call from the nuncio, who said that he had gotten a phone call from the ambassador to Egypt, who indicated that Vice President Gore wanted to meet. And we were thinking, well, do we really want to do that? And in the meantime, we had one of the people that was on our team was Joaquin Navarro Valls, who was the next picture. And so Joaquin Navarro Valls, he was the Holy Father's spokesperson. And so while in previous conferences, we did not have someone who was able to deal with the press because we were all involved in negotiations, Joaquin was able to deal with the press on an hourly basis. And he had just previous to this had found some traffic, telex traffic between the State Department and the embassies, saying that they should have a right to abortion and push that as a right, an international right. And so he brought that to the world's attention. And Vice President Gore was trying to deny it. And so in the meantime, he calls us into this meeting. And so we go into this meeting. But it was ironic because on the day of the meeting, our armed guard was late in arriving. And so the Archbishop and the rest of the delegation had to go along. And I waited for the armed guard. And so then the armed guard comes. And by the time we get there, and they have a machine gun in their car, and they're going up sidewalks and dodging chickens, and it was an insane trip to this meeting. And when we got in and to the meeting, and the vice president said he couldn't help but notice that Dr. Navarro Valls was not there. And so he said, be sure to give him my best regards. And so when we got back, and so the vice president said that he asked us if we would sign off on the document. And I said that we would absolutely sign off as long as it was negotiated in good faith, that we would sign off on it just like we had done in the previous conferences. And so he said he was very pleased to see that, and he was encouraged. And then we got back to the convent where we were staying, and Joaquin came up to me and he said, "So, John, did you see what your friend Vice President Gore did?" And I said, "Well, no, and he's not my friend, but what did he do?" And so he showed me that he had issued a press release saying that he had accepted the Vatican's invitation to meet, which wasn't the case at all. We had accepted his invitation, and he was more convinced than ever that they would never sign off, that the Vatican would never sign off on the document. So we were put up on a false premise to go to this meeting in order for him to be able to say that he had met with us, and then he did not tell the truth about what happened in the meeting. And so at the end of this, we negotiated and negotiated and negotiated, but they would part of the negotiating tactics of the UN are that they put you in hot, airless rooms, and they would tend to belittle our position. And then they kept trying to say that there was a consensus document. Well, the definition of consensus is that everybody agrees, and we happen to have about 14 or 15 countries that were totally on our side. So they just couldn't push it through. And in the end, we were able to get what we called a partial consensus, so that there was a whole consensus on various chapters, but only a partial consensus on those paragraphs in which we still found that there were significant problems. And then we were able to do an explanation of our position at the end of each paragraph, so that whenever anybody would read the final document, they would see what the Holy See's position was. and see what other countries' positions were, so that they couldn't just shove this thing through. And it was not by no means a complete success, but we certainly they did not come out of the conference with what they had hoped for, which would be an international right to abortion. And so it was, in that sense, really quite a success. And one of the reasons for it was that as a result of the popes having written to all of the various presidents and prime ministers, Benazir Bhutto, who ironically was the prime minister of Pakistan, from which Nafis Sadiq herself came, she got up and said, and I quote, "This conference must not be viewed as a universal social charter seeking to impose adultery, abortion, sex education on societies and religion with their own social ethics." And thus you can see her focus on family and ethics, which very much aligned with the Christian values that the Pope had highlighted and had written to all of the heads of state about. And Al-Azhar University ended up denouncing the draft document. And Al-Azhar University is the university for Muslim thought, and it is in Cairo. And the Pope also managed to attract the attention of very many NGOs throughout the world who had never been at the United Nations. And so you have organizations such as CFAM, which is the Catholic Family Organization, which acted as an umbrella for many other NGOs who were pro-life and pro-family, who attended and made sure that it did not look like there was no one else to support the values of life and the family. And so in the end, you can see that because of John Paul's providential leadership, he turned the 14 acres of the Holy See and obviously of the Church in general as a global force, and we had to face down both the United States and the European Union at that point. And so it really was something that I thought was extraordinarily providential, that we were able, as it was sort of like Goliath meeting David, and but we did manage to hold the line. And so Bhutto's final quote, she said that the traditional family is the anchor on which the individual relies as he embarks on the journey of life. And so I think that as we look now at the current Holy Father, whom you'll see that as it happens, I happened to be with him last week. The last pictures, Sheila, that's Bhutto, and then the final picture there, that was me last weekend handing. My wife passed away 2 months ago, and I handed the Holy Father a prayer card, and he promised to pray for her. So I'm hopeful that the Holy Father will, in the great tradition of John Paul II, take to heart the issues that are at stake at the United Nations, and that he will make sure that abortion, the rights to abortion, are not made into an international right, and that he will continue to speak forcefully in favor of the family. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for your presentation. Now we will entertain questions from our participants. Our Q&A moderator, Sheila Roth, is ITEST Administrative Assistant and Board Member.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris, and to John and Jane for your great presentations. And we have a few questions in our chat room. First one is from Sister Carla May Streeter. She says, what is the state of the UN in updating and renewing its charter with a view to adequate representation of 193 members versus the number of 24 75 years ago?
Well, my understanding is that with the entry of each country, they sign on to the charter. And so it's an automatic updating of the membership, and the charter remains the same.
Okay. Here is a question, let's see, from Francis. He said, my question is this: is there a mechanism for the reform of the United Nations in view of its original principles and binding resolutions? For example, man means at the very least a biological man from conception to death, and similarly, woman means a biological woman from conception until death.
I can tell you, I mean, the UN itself has never defined that. But what came about was very interesting in the next negotiation, which was for Beijing. I was at a meeting with Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and they had told me that we should be very cautious about the word gender. And at the time I thought, you know, are you not in favor of women's rights, right? And so they ended up saying, no, it's not that we're not in favor of women's rights, but gender can mean a bunch of things. And we said, like what? And they said it's 5 sexes. And I said, I mean, you could have knocked me over with a feather. And I said, really? What are the 5 sexes? And they said, male, female, hermaphrodites in the middle, and then transgender on either side. And so I thought that they were really, that maybe they were on some drug or something. I really just couldn't figure it out. And so I went home and I was, we had a nanny from Russia, and I asked her to please clear the deck because I needed to use my computer to send a fax to the Vatican. And as I sat down, there was a syllabus on the desk a course that she was forced to take called Reimagining Gender. And so I'm talking 1995, right? And so in 1995, we went into this conference suddenly realizing that gender didn't mean, we didn't know what it meant. We thought we knew what it meant, but we didn't know what it meant. And so the woman in question, who ended up becoming the head of the foreign minister of Honduras in her career, said that she would like to, the way in the United Nations that you do things is if you don't agree with language, you put brackets around it. And then once the brackets are put around it, that language cannot be used unless the person putting brackets around it takes the brackets off. And so she said, I'd like to put brackets around the word gender. And so the chairman said, in this sentence, she said, no. She said, in this paragraph, she said, no. In this chapter, no. I want brackets put around the word gender wherever it appears in the entire document. Well, there were over 254 mentions of the word gender in the document. And the whole place just blew up. I mean, they had to stop the meeting. And she was the first speaker. So it got off to quite an interesting start. And in the end, the ambassador from Australia said, specifically asked the distinguished representative to take off the brackets on the word gender, since it's been used at the United Nations for many years. And she responded, well, I will take off the brackets once it is defined, first of all. And the second thing is I would request that you take off the brackets on words I think that have been used for many years at the UN, which are human being. And they had bracketed the word human being because it might imply that a fetus was human, right? So we were off to the races. The battle had begun. I mean, just unbelievable. And so in the end, the definition was reached that gender is meant as and Jane probably remembers the exact definition better, but it was it is meant as it has always been meant, something like that, so that it still didn't define it, but at least it didn't try to move it into some other territory. And to my, I have not been negotiating at the UN for many years, so but my understanding is that they've never come up with a quote unquote progressive definition that does not that would not imply that gender means male and female.
The way that it worked is they held a working group of 60 countries to try to define gender. And because gender had been sprinkled into the documents in the mid-1990s and other conferences, and this is why these conferences were important, they started to insert gender. They were always inserted into paragraphs with women and children, so most of the states just thought it was a synonym for either male, female, or a synonym for women. No one really knew because you just don't define these terms. When we got to the Beijing conference, it was 233 times in the document, and that's rang the bell and why people started to fight it. The working group said, well, no, it's going to be the same as we've already treated it. Well, there was, this general understanding that it was based on biology, male, female. So the Holy See was not content with the non-definition perspective, so it wrote its own reservation and basically said that it's based on male and female. It's biological. It's based on biology. But it doesn't mean that roles are determined. So the fact that a woman is a woman doesn't mean that she can't drive, or a man is a man and he doesn't cook. So it rejected this biological determinism, but had a pretty nuanced position, basing everything on biological sex. And so later, when the gender feminists were looking at what had happened, 20, 30 years later, they recognize that gender is an ambiguous term even amongst them. No one knows how to define it. Number two, they talk about how the Holy See defanged the word. What does that mean? That means that the original understanding of gender, according to that original syllabus that John had and then floated, was supposed to mean exactly what we're dealing with now in society, the full LGBT plus Q range. That was intended back in the 1990s, and that was essentially blocked by the Holy See and the Allies and their group, essentially blocked. It wasn't until the LGBT lobbying movement was invited in to be accredited. It had been blocked from being accredited numerous times because within its umbrella group, it had included pedophile groups. And until it got rid of the pedophile groups from its group, it wasn't allowed in the United Nations. Once it was allowed into the United Nations, then it was men self-identifying as homosexual that actually was able to use the term sexual orientation and gender identity. The acronym is SOGI, and promote that. And today we have a special rapporteur on stopping violence on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity, but those terms have never been defined. So from a real rule of law perspective, it's a bit of a joke because you actually have a special rapporteur based on terminology that's not defined and agreed upon by nation states. And that now is the focal point for promoting gender ideology throughout the world.
All right, very good. Thank you. We have a question from Galindo, and he has his hand up, and I don't really understand the question, so I'm going to ask him to unmute to ask the question. Go ahead.
My question is this. Sorry for ask you in this way. Do you think that United Nations tried to apply social Darwinism to the rest of the world? Because for the matter that I saw is the population control looks like it's more like a Malthusian stuff combined with environmental situations. What do you think about it?
Well, I don't think you're far off. Okay, so I think if you look at the book by Margaret Peters, Global Governance, and this transformation that took place from 1945 to 1996, she doesn't use exactly that term, the social Darwinism. What she uses postmodernism and looks at, and she gives you a philosophical analysis and brings you through the philosophy that's now being used top down. And she goes into detail. And her biggest thing is to say that there was this revolution in terms of the ideology. So that would include the reasons for why they're pushing it. Number two, the semantics, the change in language and the concepts. Politically, because we've moved from the key mover as a nation state to actually a group, which includes, non-governmental organizations and CEOs as our new kind of partnerships. And then they are pushing their ideology. What looks like also is this idea of almost like creating a Politburo, a communism top down in some situations. And we can see that there's similarities with how the communist China operates and works. And so there's a number of different philosophies and ideologies at work, I think, on this level. And I think it would be worthwhile for you to take a look at Marguerite Peters' book to get a better understanding.
Thank you so much.
If I can just
Thank you.
comment briefly on that, there was no question about the fact that they wanted to, the whole idea of the population conference was to limit population. I mean, it was their goal completely. And they would talk about how we had to, people had to be accommodated in the cities, and we would say, well, what about the rural areas? Just to keep people in the rural areas. But everything was finally, nothing was associated with families generally, and we always had to put in the word family because it was as if everybody was going to move into the cities and live in pods. I mean, it was just a horrible attitude towards society. I remember one day I went up to Nafis Sadiq and I said, so Nafis, why are you so against the Vatican? I said, we have the lowest population in the world. She took great offense. She said, well, you might have as the Vatican City, but you're trying to promote people having children. And so you see now where many countries are desperately trying to increase their populations, and because they just don't have enough. And I live in Italy, and the Italian population it's devastating because it's all going to be old people, and I told them that at the time, but nobody was listening,
That's the curious thing about this depopulation. The main theme has been depopulation and continues to be on the UN level for many, many years. But we do know that we've got this problem nationally. And so there's two different sets of interests. There's global actors that are pushing this, and there's various groups of these global actors, and then you have the reality that's happening on the nation state. And this is also relevant to the open borders policies that are being promoted by some of the global actors. Some of these global actors are promoting open borders so that they can create, or it kind of, into this kind of idea of global citizenship and the global movement of people. And once you get the global movement of people, then you can talk about digital passports and having information on health and et cetera. And that becomes a tool for control. Now, for those that are not familiar with the United Nations, it's United Nations conferences and are basically paying their bills and educating their children, this sounds like a big conspiracy theory. But for those that are on the level that have been watching the developments for over 30, 40 years, this is just the way these things work. And we saw within COVID that the protocols were in place within 2 weeks worldwide. And that's because of the global governance regime, which is private-public partnerships. They have partnerships with the businesses, but also with the executives within government of the different ministries. You're bypassing some of your parliamentary processes, and some of them were absolutely closed down during COVID. And then you also have world leaders that have been meeting within the World Economic Forum in Davos annually, and it's been up and running for about 50 years. And it brings in about 2,000 people. So that's including non-governmental organizations, 150 leaders. So, and then their meetings are all about promoting things globally. This is their world. This is what they want to do. And that means that they've got direct lines into leaders. You know, Klaus Schwab or someone important can pick up the phone and talk to, when he was Prime Minister of of Canada, Trudeau, and tell him what he thinks needs to happen for the protocol. So, or you can get people or partners individually dealing with executives in the different ministries, and then they're pumping out policies. So what people are not understanding is the depth of the network and how it's integrated and how it's developed. And according to Margaret Peters, it's a revolution, not an evolution, and that's something that needs to be studied and debated. She sees the revolution as these UN conferences that grabbed on to sustainable development as the key integrative tool for content and process, and that's where we are now with Agenda 2030 and all of what that means.
All right, great, thank you. We have a question from Chris Riley. He says, other major religions represented at the UN, and are there formal or unofficial opportunities at the UN for collaboration based on faith? Either of you can take that.
If you look at the Holy See, why it's there, to me, as a Catholic, it's providential. So you have the Roman Empire then disintegrates and the church moves in, because you have the Constantine in 313, there's a tolerance after the persecutions, and then eventually the church fills that gap. And so you have the Papal States, and then the negotiations and mediation and arbitration happening of the Pope between different countries. And so you have this whole history of the Holy See. And when I look at the Holy See within the United Nations Forum, to me, it's the soul of the forum, and that's providential. And so if you go back and you look from a whole Catholic perspective of man, the creature, man, the sinner, man redeemed in Christ, the incarnation, the whole big picture, salvation history as this huge love story with humanity. And you have the death and resurrection of Christ. And you have, he's not going to leave us alone. He creates his church, and that's a mission. And it's his mission to carry out his mission that we all shall have eternal life and live in him. So when you look at this huge, broad salvation history perspective, when you're seeing that the Holy See is in there and has a voice and is equivalent to a state, it's providential. There is no other entity that has that. Certainly you have Muslim states that church and state are not separated. Certainly you have non-governmental organizations, religious organizations that are maybe getting together with the world churches. So they've got forums for religious organizations to meet. But the Catholic Church is not an organization. As I said in the terminology section, it's a community of faith and sacraments, and it's a visible and invisible community because we have the community of the saints. So it's not an international organization. And one of the things that we always have to be careful with, I would think, the Holy See and its diplomats, is not to give the impression that we're here just to be part of the group. And we're just going along with whatever is said on migration, and we don't have a critical attitude towards some of the problems. If you look at the statements of John Paul II to the General Assembly and Pope Benedict, for example, as well, the 16th, what you have is, you have congratulations on what you've done, A, B, C, and D, but you really need to look at these issues, and here's the problem, E, F, and G. And so there's always an encouragement for those things that are good, but there's also has to be a critical assessment, because the Pope is a vicar of Christ, and the voice is not only for Catholics, it's for everyone in the world to receive eternal life. And that message, there's certain morals and ethics, that there's a special voice. The Holy See is not just another partner, it is not a non-governmental organization, and it's not just a mere stakeholder. And I'm saying that from the perspective of the Holy See, in terms of the Church and the mission of Christ. I'm not looking at it from the perspective of the United Nations.
I would say that the one almost ironic parallel could be King Charles as the head of the Church of England, but he wouldn't come and start trying to speak religiously. It just wouldn't happen. Whereas we don't come and speak as a state. We speak as the Catholic Church. And
right. So the Pope is not there as head of Vatican City State. The Pope is there as the Pope itself. The Pope is a person. And when you compare the Holy See to the United States, you don't talk about Obama, Clinton, or Trump. You talk about the United States. And when you're thinking of a state, you're thinking of a territory, a population, the capacity to enter into negotiations, and defined territory, defined population, capacity to enter into relations with states and a government. When you look at those four characteristics, when you're looking at the Holy See, they don't go. We talk about the Holy See, but it's the Pope. He has a capacity to enter into relations, and that becomes your predominant issue. His territory is not the Holy See. He's got sovereignty over a territory, but that isn't the Holy See. The territory is Vatican City State. In terms of a defined population, people aren't born to be Vatican State citizens. The citizenship is based on employment, for example, cardinals, and then you have residents. And so that's kind of different than what else is happening in terms of their population. So that's why it's called sui generis. It's unto itself. It's called, if you look at the document that talks about its participation in the UN General Assembly, they refer to it as a state. It's equivalent to a state and treat it as a state, because one of the most important elements is the capacity to carry on relations between states. And when the ambassadors from other states, the ambassadors are linked to the Pope, not to Vatican City State. So that's why this whole having a grip on these three different entities is almost like the Trinity. You're going to have to deal with the three different entities, and the Holy See is not an international organization, and neither is the Church. But if we continue to take positions in a sense that we're just agreeing with other states on migration and not having a critical view of different issues that are involved in that, or not even migration, but a whole host of issues, we're going to get ourselves into trouble, because it's the voice of Christ, and we have to keep into that mission.
Right, very good. We have two more questions. I think we might have time just for one, but let's try it. Alessandro says, Pope Leo XIV recently reminded us that AI must always serve the human person and never undermine dignity. Do you see a role for the Holy See in shaping international discussions on AI ethics?
Well, it's already, the Pope is already integrally related to the AI issue. So if you Google AI and the Roman Curia, there's been a number of initiatives by various dicasteries, and those are his departments. And there's a major document that was written on, I think it's called Antigua et Nova, and it's a document all on AI. And it doesn't include an understanding of divine intelligence, which is kind of interesting. It talks about human intelligence, and And it's a long document, and it has some anthropology there that can help the discussions. And so the Pope, through his delegates and through his departments and through the speeches and interventions at the United Nations, is extremely active on this issue.
And the Pope, that was the reason that he chose Leo the 13th, was in order to be active on social issues, in particular relating to labor and dignity of labor. And so we are finding ourselves refocusing on Catholic social teaching in a way that hadn't happened for quite a few years.
I think it's, you know, as I think back then, his predecessor and who he's named after, it was an industrial revolution that they were dealing with. And the papacy sees, from what I can tell of what's been written by Pope Francis, and he's been very active, and Pope Leo the 14th, is that this is another revolution. It's an actual technological revolution that needs to be addressed.
Okay, thank you. One last question from Jackie Curcio-Gwynn. How can you share this vital information to the Church domestically and internationally as a whole?
I think it's a question for you, Sheila, because we've done this little. These things can be courses. I used to teach a course on international law.
Oh yeah, I agree with you. There could be long courses on this, I'm sure.
Right. So I used to teach a course on this in international law, but I understand that the link to this will be sent out, and so this will be available. This is something I think that needs to be taught. I think courses need to be held, and certainly I'm available, as well as John, to continue to talk about these issues as we go forward.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we will be sharing the link to the recording of this webinar with everyone who has registered, and then it will also be on our website where you found the registration for this webinar. It will be posted there and be able to be shared to watch on demand at any time. And with that, I want to thank you for your participation in the Q&A, John and Jane, and I'm going to send it back over to Chris now for closing up the webinar.
Okay. Well, that wraps up our Q&A. Thank you, everyone, for your participation in this webinar. Thank you especially to Dr. Jane Adolphe and Dr. John Klink for your presentations. Thank you to Sister Carla May Streeter and Father Vincent Uke for leading us in prayer. In conclusion, Father Vincent Uke, retired priest of the Diocese of Trenton, New Jersey, will offer our closing prayer.
Almighty God, we thank you for enabling the Holy See to have input in the discussions of the general debates of the General Assembly. Its influence in the decision-making process, making the members aware of moral norms of natural law, has offered hope in making countries think more deeply about the consequences of their votes to assist the countries of the world, especially the developing nations and the nations in conflict. As we enter the new era of artificial intelligence, may we find ways of protecting us from the violences against natural law. May our Blessed Mother intercede for us in this great endeavor, and we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. And may Almighty God bless you all, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Thank you, Father. Be sure, everyone, to check out future webinars and other faith science topics at our website, www.faithscience.org. Thank you for joining us.